Leadership. It's a word that conjures images of strong, decisive figures, guiding us through difficult times. But what happens when leadership takes a wrong turn, veering off the path of righteousness and into the murky depths of tyranny? Today, we're diving into the abyss of dictatorial rule, examining the tactics used by history's most infamous figures. We'll explore how these individuals acquired power, maintained their iron grip, and the devastating consequences their rule had on their nations. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. Promises of change, hope, and a better tomorrow often lure the masses. Often these individuals sweep into power promising stability, reform, a brighter future. They captivate the hearts and minds of the people, but power, much like a feral raccoon that's gotten into a bag of sugar, is inherently messy and intoxicating. It can quickly spiral out of control. The allure of power is strong, and it can corrupt even the most well-meaning individuals. Take for instance Joseph Stalin, a man who rose to power with grand visions. He promised to modernize the Soviet Union, transforming it into an industrial powerhouse. His vision was compelling, and he did, but at what cost? The human toll was staggering. Millions dead in forced labor camps, purges and famines. The price of progress was paid in blood. Or consider North Korea's Kim Jong-un, a leader who inherited a legacy of tyranny. Inheriting a family business of oppression and continuing the legacy with disturbing enthusiasm. His rule is marked by fear and control. Absolute power makes the distinction between personal whims and national interest as blurry as my vision after a 3-day-old gas station burrito. The lines are dangerously crossed. These leaders surround themselves with yes men, individuals more interested in keeping their heads attached to their necks than speaking truth to power. They create echo chambers, dissent is silenced, opposition crushed, and fear becomes the tool of governance. Dissent is silenced, opposition crushed, and any semblance of accountability evaporates faster than a puddle of water in Death Valley. The voice of the people is stifled. The result? A system where the leader's word is law, and questioning their decisions is tantamount to treason. The consequences are dire. The result? A system where the leader's word is law, and questioning their decisions is tantamount to treason. The consequences are dire. And so, the cycle of absolute power continues, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. You know what's not a great look for a leader? Being afraid of their own people? That's the defining characteristic of a tyrant. They're terrified of anyone who might question their authority or challenge their narrative. So what do? They crack down, harder than a toddler trying to fit a square block into a round hole. Freedom of speech? More like freedom to whisper sweet nothings to your houseplants. Freedom of the press? Please, the only approved narrative is the one printed on the back of the leader's cereal box. Hitler had his Gestapo, a terrifyingly efficient secret police force that silenced dissent. Mao Zedong unleashed the Cultural Revolution, targeting anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary. These regimes understand that fear is a powerful motivator, keeping people in line and preventing them from speaking out. The message is clear: step out of line, and you'll face dire consequences. There's a reason why dictators love statues of themselves. It's not just because they're narcissists, although that's definitely part of it. Personality cults are a fantastic way to maintain control over a population. If you can convince people that you're not just a leader but a demigod, a savior, then who are they to question your decisions? Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, perfected this tactic. He wasn't just a leader, he was the eternal president. His birthday a national holiday, his portraits plastered everywhere. Saddam Hussein went for a similar vibe in Iraq, erecting giant statues of himself and renaming cities after himself. The goal of these personality cults is to create an image of infallibility, convincing people that the leader is always right. Chapter 4: Control through fear and violence. You know that feeling when you walk past a particularly menacing-looking goose and it gives you the side eye, that unsettling sensation that makes you quicken your pace and avoid eye contact? That's the feeling dictators want their citizens to have. A constant, gnawing sense of dread that keeps everyone on edge. Because when you're living in a constant state of low-grade terror, you're less likely to cause trouble. You're more likely to comply, to follow orders without question, and to avoid drawing attention to yourself. How do they achieve this delightful ambiance of perpetual unease? through a combination of propaganda, intimidation, and the ever-present threat of violence. By creating a climate of fear where the threat of violence, whether real or implied, hangs over everything. Soldiers patrol the streets, shadowy figures lurk in alleyways, and the sense of danger is omnipresent. Take Pol Pot, the architect of the Cambodian genocide. His regime, the Khmer Rouge, was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 2 million people. His brutal tactics included mass executions, forced labor camps, and widespread famine, creating an environment where fear was a daily reality. Francisco Franco ruled Spain with an iron fist for nearly 40 years, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. His regime used similar tactics to maintain control. These leaders rely on secret police forces, mass surveillance, and the threat of imprisonment, torture, or death to keep their populations in check. The mere suspicion of dissent could lead to severe punishment. They create an atmosphere where anyone could be an informer, and any perceived slight could have dire consequences. Neighbors turn on neighbors, and trust becomes a rare commodity. It's a horrifyingly effective method of control, turning citizens into informants and ensuring that any opposition remains fragmented and terrified. The pervasive fear ensures that resistance is not just difficult, but nearly impossible. Chapter 5. Manipulation and Propaganda. If there's one thing dictators understand, it's the power of a good story. And by good story, I mean a carefully constructed narrative designed to manipulate and control the populace. This is where propaganda comes in, the lifeblood of a dictatorial regime. By controlling the media, education, and even the arts, these leaders ensure that their version of events becomes the accepted truth. Remember Joseph Goebbels? Hitler's minister of propaganda used radio, film, and print to demonize enemies and glorify the Nazi Party. He famously said, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." Fidel Castro, despite his revolution's initial promise of freedom, quickly established a system of strict media control in Cuba. By controlling the flow of information, these regimes create an echo chamber where their version of events is the only one that matters. Dissent is silenced, alternative viewpoints are suppressed, and critical thinking becomes as rare as an honest politician. Chapter 6. Economic Control and Exploitation. Running a dictatorship is expensive. The costs are astronomical and never-ending. You've got giant statues to erect, often as a means to glorify the leader and instill a sense of omnipresence. Elaborate military parades to stage, showcasing power and intimidating any potential dissent. And a seemingly endless supply of gold-plated bathroom fixtures to acquire, symbolizing the opulence and excess of the ruling class. And where does all this money come from? From the people, of course. The very citizens who are often struggling to make ends meet. This often takes the form of blatant economic manipulation, where financial systems are rigged to benefit the few. The dictator and their cronies control key industries, siphon off profits, and live in unimaginable luxury. Meanwhile, the rest of the population is left to fight over the scraps, struggling to survive in dire conditions. Robert Mugabe, the former president of Zimbabwe, was a master of this tactic. His regime exemplified economic exploitation. Under his rule, the country's once thriving economy was driven into the ground through corruption, mismanagement, and hyperinflation, leading to widespread suffering. Nicolas Maduro, despite presiding over a country with the world's largest oil reserves, has followed a similar path. He has managed to create a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, with shortages of basic necessities and rampant poverty. This economic control serves a dual purpose. It enriches the dictator and their inner circle, allowing them to live in luxury while the rest of the country suffers. It also keeps the population dependent, ensuring they are too preoccupied with survival to challenge the regime. People are forced to work in harsh conditions, often for meager wages, just to get by. It's a cynical and brutal system that traps people in a cycle of poverty and despair, with little hope for a better future. Chapter 7. Legacy of Destruction. Here's the thing about dictators, they eventually leave power. Sometimes it's through death, sometimes it's through revolution, but whatever the reason, their departure rarely ushers in an era of peace and prosperity. The legacy of dictatorial rule is often one of devastation, division, and deep festering wounds on the national psyche. Take Libya, for example. After Muammar Gaddafi's 4-decade reign ended in 2011, the country descended into chaos and civil war. Iraq, after the US-led invasion toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, has struggled to achieve stability amid sectarian violence and political instability. Dictatorships concentrate power, suppress dissent, and erode institutions, leaving behind a vacuum easily exploited by opportunists and extremists. It's a sobering reminder that the road to recovery from tyranny is long and fraught with challenges. Outro: The Price of Freedom. So, there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the dark side of leadership. It's essential to understand how these regimes operate, how they rise to power, and the devastating consequences they have on their people. Tyranny doesn't just happen overnight. It's a slow, insidious process, often starting with small erosions of freedom and subtle manipulations of the truth. That's why it's crucial to stay informed, be vigilant, and call out injustice wherever we see it. We must hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency, and never take our freedoms for granted. Understanding the dark side of leadership helps us recognize the signs of tyranny and the importance of checks and balances in power. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that true leadership uplifts rather than oppresses.